So, in the somewhat wee hours of the night, actually not the wee hours, it's the early evening, which has been not the case for these, there we go, which, unusual for recording this late, which isn't that late, but it's late for the time. I've noted that yesterday I'm normally recording when the sun is out, and the sun is most definitely not out at this hour. But it's just one of those long Saturdays where we get to the work when we get to it. And so on and off today, I've gotten to some projects, and now finally to PPM number 24, originally written the 7th of March 2004. And this is, this is the 8th of March, right? So leap year was 2004, so we're on the current meditation, but in terms of the date, we're a day ahead. So yesterday's meditation went back to Socrates, and if you were to have a copy of the original writings that I typed up, printed, and put in my my binder, these are actually copies of that material that I made at Hofstra, you would note that if you were to compare that to Being and Learning, the book that was published about, let's see, 8 years after these were written, full 8 years later, you would note that the meditations that I'm now reading from are the beginning of the second chapter, which is on Socrates. So I do an extended exploration of Socrates at this point, and that's kind of where we left off. And yesterday I was talking about how Socrates received the message from the gods. He was put underway by on his mission by this message. He described this message as one that he claims to that had perplexed him, because he couldn't believe that it was true that he was the wisest of all, and then discovered in the process of going and trying to find someone wiser than he was that in fact he did have a kind of wisdom, a wisdom that was human, and that was to say that he knew his limits, I suppose. All that he knew is that he knew nothing at all. And I haven't yet talked about that particular formula, Socratic maxim, but that's part of his response to the God's claim that he was wisest. But in my commentary yesterday, I talked about how his questioning of the assertion, Socrates, you are wisest, sets off a tradition of philosophy as one in which tradition is being renewed and regenerated insofar as it is being interrupted and questioned and sort of then taken up anew. Okay, so on to the meditation that is PPM 24. And talking a little bit more about the reciprocity of the gifts, the reciprocity of the gift of the human being to being, and back to the human being from being. Just making sure we're on the right, yes. Okay. The mutual exchange of the gift of teachability is the foundation of the teaching-learning relationship. We can with some confidence call this relationship one of friendship, and characterize the exchange as an expression of what we might call the philosophy of love. Socrates alludes to this when, at the end of his great speech in Plato's Symposium, he synthesizes the lesson he was once given by the Manichaean woman called Diotima, or Diotima, one who was deeply versed in the truth which we find unanswerable, quote, and who, quote, taught Socrates the philosophy of love, unquote. It is from his reception of her teaching that Socrates bases his own work as a teacher on the cultivation of friendship. His speech culminates with the declaration that those who have had their eyes opened to a beauty which penetrates and exceeds all life forms will have found themselves in a learning beyond all learning. In finding themselves in this learning, an apprentice will have encountered, quote, the special lore that pertains to nothing but the beautiful itself, unquote, from the Symposium 21D. This special lore reduces all learning to the play between unconcealment and concealment. The beautiful is the appearing and the shining forth, the excess of being that floods through the horizon of beings. It also pertains to the nameless place from whence presencing appears. This nothing is now a gap that stands between being and the horizon of beings, which makes possible the passing of gifts, the saying of the said, the tidings, and hearing of evocative speech. Socrates' great speech, moreover, shows us why this giving is a sharing and handing on of what one has received. What is offered is already, it is the special lore. As lore, it is always already available to be learned. Lore is an offering of what can be learned. The cognate of lore is learn. In Old English, leorimien. And we see that at the core of learning is an exchange of gifts. Lore is what is offered, and at its core it represents the relational ground of learning and teaching. The special lore is a teaching which attunes eyes toward a vision of the relationship which is given in the tidings. Diotima tells Socrates that he, in turn, tells the company of friends he is addressing at the gathering taking place. Let me start that one over again. Diotima tells Socrates, and he in turn tells the company of friends he is addressing at the gathering taking place at the poet Agathon's home. The life worth living is the one undertaken under the spell of this beauty that is always already appearing. To live under this spell, to be possessed by the magic of presencing, to be attuned to the excess unfolding as possibility, is to seek connections, to open up to the other and receive them as a friend. Diotima tells Socrates that the one, quote, whose eyes had been opened to the vision, and who had gazed upon it in true contemplation, he shall be called the friend of God. Unquote. Symposium lines 21e through 22a. For Socrates, Diotima's teaching, her offering to him of this lore, is the very gift he attempted to give others in drawing them into his perplexity, his confusion, his uncertain ground. And letting learning happen, Socrates offered a gift, the same gift he received from Diotima. Quote, this gentleman was the doctrine of Diotima. I was convinced in that conviction to try to bring others to the same creed, and to convince them that if we are to make this gift our own, love will help our mortal nature more than all the world. Unquote. Also from Symposium. To hear the message of the gods, then, is to receive teachability. To hear the message of the gods is to bear this message to others, to offer it to others. To bear this message is to teach, but to teach is nothing else than this, to let learning happen. And letting learning happen, we remain friends of the gods, who bear the message of the tide, the beyond, from whence appears being. For Socrates, letting learning happen, reposing his friends by drawing them into being questionable, was also a deposing of the authoritative juridical voice, a removal from power of the self-certain, smug subject. In reposing his friends, he deposed the I that stands apart, against, and above, in order to draw them together and cultivate a common world together. Thus, deposing is a removing and a replacing. To draw into the questionable is to place, poser. But while deposing means removing from high authority, it also means to bear witness, to testify. To bear up, to endure cheerfully the tidings of the tide, is thus to bear witness to the lore. But depose is also to divest, to put aside. We see how being reposed, held out into the nothing, to emptiness, is a divestment, an emptying, an opening, a waiting, a receiving. Here we see how bearing up is a bearing witness, and enduring cheerfully is the teaching, which lets nothing else happen but learning, by the teacher who is more teachable than her apprentices. Socrates is called the friend of the gods and a friend of mortals. He is both apprentice, the one who receives, and the teacher, the one who gives. And this is why he sought to, quote, cultivate and worship love and bid others to do the same, unquote. And that's from Symposium 212b. And that's where it ends. So, this particular meditation, I return to this later, that is the Symposium, which is very important for a number of reasons, but I think that one of the most important reasons is with this quotation from Socrates, where he talks of love as a gift. And he says, in fact, the teaching he received about love from Diotima was a gift. So he says, this gentleman, speaking in the Symposium to the crowd, the group of guys that were there at Agathon's house, this gentleman was the doctrine of Diotima. I was convinced, and in that conviction, I try to bring others to the same creed. What I'm calling the philosophy of love. I'm not calling it. Socrates called it. The teaching is the philosophy of love. That's the creed. And to convince them that if we are to make this gift our own, philosophy of love, love will help our mortal nature more than anything in the world. So, great quotation, right? Because in the midst of talking about this give and take between being and beings, and specifically the human being as receiving the gift of learning, the gift of learning from being, and the human being returning up and saying, yes, I'm here, teach me, I am teachable. And in that reciprocity, talking about that as an exchange of gifts, to then introduce this idea, I think is key, right? And interesting and important, because it is returning to the exemplar, and he remains that for us, Socrates, and he's using this language of giving. This gift, if we are to make this gift our own, this gift being the philosophy of love, it will help our mortal nature more than more than all the world. Now, of course, this teaching teaches us, it's a sort of one of the principal moments where there's a teaching of transcendence, right? So there's contemplation in this classical sense of leaving the world and contemplating the source of all things, which is love. We're not taking this up in this way. So what I try to do is to say that the philosophy of love is carried forward in the world. So it's not something that takes us away from the world, but in fact takes us into the world, and takes us into the world in a very specific way. And that is in the way of cultivating community, cultivating friendship. Which, if you know the Symposium, or you don't, but in the Symposium, if you know it, that what's going on here is that they're a group of friends, all coming from sort of different walks of life, and they're having a discussion. It's a dinner party, and they're having this discussion about the meaning of love. Some of them are drunk, many of them are drunk. Of course, for Socrates, who was completely sober. And in his sobriety, he really offers them up a speech that talks of this teaching of a love that is greater than all human love. But he talks about this love that is greater than all human love as one that we need to return to one another, and to bring it, to make it our own, to make this gift our own. I think to me that this is such a powerful statement, and it really is the sense in which the relationship between being and learning, again, talking about culture and tradition yesterday, today, talking about it in terms of human community and forming the bonds of human community. So that's the kind of important philosophical point. The language thing that's going on here is kind of cool, talking about lore. Now, trying to find out where that gets introduced. I see Socrates creates what is offered here is a special lore. Right. So, lore, two things that are important in this meditation. One is lore, and I don't quite even know how it is that I started talking about that, although something tells me that it was Heidegger that might have inspired me. But lore as, and then tracing lore, the cognate of lore, to learn. In the old English, it's spelled L-E-O-R-N-I-A-N. So it's learning. So lore is to learn. And lore is also, the reason that's also important here is that when you think of the word lore in sort of its everyday usage, you think of like a story that's handed down, right? So the lore, it's almost like the mystery of, not the mystery, the legend. I'm sorry, the legend. So legend. So the legend. So the Socrates story about Diotima is a lore because it's a legend, right? And so by talking about Socrates, the teaching he received, the only one that I know of, where he says, I learned directly from this person, woman, that's important, Diotima, it's almost like it has a legend quality. Well, the legend of Socrates learning from Diotima, right? And he himself is sort of recounting it as a kind of a legend. Well, once upon a time, I met this woman and she taught me this teaching, and this is the teaching of love. So it's kind of like a lore, right? It's a lore. The philosophy of love as the teaching, Socrates, the teaching of Diotima to Socrates is a legend. It's a lore. So it's kind of like a fable. And it's a fable meaning that it doesn't matter if it's true, if she did or did not exist. And as far as I know, that's the only time that she's mentioned. And I don't know that there's any historical record of her. But that's beside the point. You know, it's a story that he's telling them to convey the point. And so in that sense, lore here was sort of interesting. And lore is working throughout a lot of this material, right? Because the mission that Socrates went on was set off by, the Oracle of Delphi, again a woman, the priestess. And again, that's legends, right? And again, so Socrates is interesting. I haven't written on this point, but when I talk about these days about Socrates 3.0 and Socrates having set into motion or bequeathed to us this kind of writing, because he wrote at the end, and we don't have any record of that. So I interpret it as we need to take out this writing that Socrates never published or never completed. Sort of gestured at it. The paper I presented last week in Chicago was all about this. So the point is that with the legend of the teaching of Diotima and the legend of the Oracle of Delphi, in a way, one of the ways we could think about this alternative writing is the writing of legends, right? And that's something to think about. So finally, is the in terms of linguistic stuff that's going on here, the etymology is, and I remember writing this, is the playing on reposing as deposing. So then talking about the reciprocity. So Socrates, and we've already talked about this, to be to hear evocative questioning is to be reposed, that is to say to be turned around and posed, in a sense, reposed, placed into Gelassenheit, placed into the position of the calm of letting be. But it's also to be reposed, to be questioned again. and here place is also poser. So to place something, so to be replaced. Deposing then is, well, when you think of again, the legal term, I talked about law yesterday, the legal term is a deposition. To depose someone is to sit them down and to question them. So drawing on that tradition, then I'm saying also that he is deposing in his questioning, but he's also deposing in the sense of depositing or getting rid of. So what he's getting rid of in his questioning is the self-certain, what I called smug ego, right? And this is in his mission. He talks a lot about how he kept encountering people that he thought would be wiser than him, smart, but they were just self-certain and smug, and they were very confident in the little thing that they knew. But that confidence wasn't enough to convince them that they were wise. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. Because they were so confident in what they knew, they were arrogant. And arrogance is really placed on the opposite spectrum of wisdom. Wisdom is to know your limits and to be humble in relationship to all that you don't know, and to then have curiosity and wonder about everything that there is to know and to see and to experience. Arrogance is this propping up of something very small to something very large, and to put its value at such a high amount as to place everything below it of a lesser value, or what's outside it. So it's like the arrogance of parochialism, right? So, I know this small bit of reality, but it is so important and it's so great, and so anything else really pales in comparison. So I don't even have to bother to know about that stuff, right? There's a moral tale that can be told there. So deposing as getting rid of. So a questioning that is also a dismantling. That's the point of deposing. All right. So yeah, okay. I think I'm going to leave it at that. And I think in my summary, I'm going to highlight this philosophy of love. So until tomorrow.